Sir Les Patterson approved of all the success down under?
Severely censored, that was.
Really?
It got worse, yes. Sadly, there aren't too many men of Sir Les's culture and finesse in Australia. I wish there were more like him.
That's right, full appreciation.
Absolutely.
How did you make your Australian show different from the one we know here?
I didn't, actually. I mean, a talk show is a talk show is a talk show. I mean, you just go for the most interesting guests, those that appeal to you most of all. There's nothing clever about doing a talk show, in my view. There's a lot of nonsense talked about it. It's really booking to the strengths of the person doing the interview. And if you, the interviewer, are interested in that person sitting opposite you, it might be a fairly interesting interview. I mean, people always assumed that the people I had on my show, I liked them all. I didn't. I mean, several I positively disliked. On the other hand, that was never the test. The test was I interested in them? It's a different thing altogether. And if I was interested, then perhaps I could get something out of them which might be interesting to the people outside.
On the other hand, in this country, I mean, you really got all the big names, whether they were British or American or whoever. But in Australia, did you not attempt perhaps to bring some people onto the programme from the outback, or people who weren't just as well known?
Oh yes, I mean you did that, but we did this in England too. I mean we had a fair mix of people who were unknown. But in Australia, of course, I mean because of the size of the population, you are more limited, and you can't assume that stars are jetting in every day like they do into London. And so perhaps you had to make the show a bit more sort of parochial, if you like. There are lots of fascinating people there, actually. People who live out in the bush there are really, really fascinating, and we had one or two of those.
People like whom?
Well, we had a young bushie out there. He arrived in the studio, and I mean, I don't know where he'd been for the past 50 years. He didn't know anybody at all. He'd never been in a television studio before. He didn't know what a camera was at all. And he came in and sat down and was totally, absolutely natural. Nothing impressed him, nothing fazed him. And did a fascinating interview. The manager of the hotel that we put him into came to me in great distress the day after he'd left and said, "Do you realise that man we put into the bridal suite, one of our best suites?" I said, "Yes." He said he slept on the floor. I mean, he just didn't bother with a bed. He'd never had a bed in his life. And it was marvellous to meet that kind of character. The difference between the fascination of Australia is one level is that person, completely unspoiled, and then somebody like Dame Edna. I mean, that's the fascination. What's in between is not really worth talking about.
You mentioned, actually, you mentioned at the beginning that to be interested in someone is one of the tricks of being a good chat show host. On the other hand, it's not always easy to relax people, particularly with all the machinery around in a television studio. No. And what do you feel was your success from that angle? I
don't really know. I suppose there's a mixture of things. I mean, I think that being an interviewer is a bit like being a driver in a car. I mean, if you give the impression to the person sitting opposite you is bound to be nervous, that in fact you're a good driver, then in fact they might relax the more quickly. If you, like sitting with a bad driver, get the impression that she or he's not in control, then quickly you get more and more nervous. I think also, strangely enough, that things that people criticise you for often help. I mean, I've been taken apart by Mr. Yarwood and people like that for this sort of body language I have. But in fact, I think it's very important because it gives a kind of atmosphere of normalcy. You see, if you watch anybody in this audience, if you talk to them, they will respond with gesture as much as verbally. And anybody who sits like that has either got piles, but I mean, they're actually interrogating you, they're leaning into you, and they're being very aggressive. So the more that you're natural, you appear to be natural, and that does include body language, then the better, I think.
On the other hand, you haven't scratched your ear or rubbed your nose once?
Not yet, but you see, Mike Yarwood just invents things about people. I mean, he invented a catchphrase for people, which in fact they never said. The only thing, too, about Mike was that, I mean, I never met a man in my life who had more body language than Mike. I mean, he was a gibbering mess. I mean, he's like St. Vitus dance. I mean, he's all over the place and he's talking normally. It's only when he gets into character that, in fact, he stops.
You once said that your father was just about the most fascinating man you ever met. What made him so special, apart from the fact, obviously, that it was your father? I
don't know. He was a rare man. He was a miner, Yorkshire miner. He was a very simple man. He had a tremendous sense of humour. I think that's what I enjoyed most about my father. And he was a Yorkshireman to the absolute end. I remember that when my wife was having our first baby, we were living in Manchester at the time, and I'd done a perfectly good and respectable deal with the National Health Service to have the baby delivered in a National Health Hospital. And I had to go down to London to work. I got a job in Fleet Street. And I left Mary behind because there was about only a month to go of the pregnancy. And my father rang me up, and he said, he was a man of few words on the telephone particularly, and he said, "Now then," he said, "job's done." I said, "What job?" He said, "They're in Yorkshire." I said, "Who's in Yorkshire?" He said, "Mary and baby." I said, "What?" He said, "I've shifted them, Wakefield, nursing home." I said, why? He said, why? He said, don't be daft. He said, if it's a lad, it's got to be born in Yorkshire. I said, why? He said, because if it's not, it can't play cricket for Yorkshire, can it? And I said to him, have you ever considered the fact that it might be a girl? Never had, of course, not at all. And thankfully, my son was born, my first child, in a nursing home in Yorkshire. And he was proved right, except he's not yet played for Yorkshire.
Actually, your father wanted you to play for Yorkshire.
Oh, he went to his grave believing I was a total failure. I mean, he really did.
Yes, you didn't?
Yes, I mean, but my father knew the difference between immortality and fame. I mean, I always wanted to be famous, and that I suppose I've become. But my father realised that if you go on television, you're famous. If you play cricket for Yorkshire, you're immortal. And he realised that. And I mean, it was a marvellous sort of bring down for me all the time, my dad, because he enjoyed what happened to me, of course he did, but he did actually have this sneaking feeling that I'd not quite done the proper thing. And I remember once when probably one of the sort of turning points in my life was when I left the local papers in Yorkshire, and I got a job on then the Manchester Guardian, which is kind of, I don't know, it was the paper. I think it still is the paper, actually. It was a writer's paper, and I was very lucky to get on it. And I dashed back across the Pennines having got this job, and which really was the turning point. And my father was in bed because my father used to get up at 5 in the morning. He was on day shift. And I went up to the bedroom there, and I woke them up. And I said, Mum, I've got the job on the Guardian. And she said, oh, it's absolutely marvellous, because that's all my mother ever wanted for me. And my dad turned over, he said, it's not like playing cricket for Yorkshire, though, is it, lad? And went back to sleep. And now, if you've got that touchstone in your life, I think that's important. That's right. Nothing much can go wrong.
Didn't he also take you down the mines when you were very young to
Yes.
put you off that?
Yes, he did. We were taken down by the National Coal Board when I was at grammar school, when I was about 13, and my father talked about the pit, but not an awful lot. Miners don't, actually, although I knew he didn't want me to go down. And we went down this pit, and I came back, and my dad was there, and he said, what have you been doing today, son? And I said, well, we went down a pit. I said, I don't know what you're on about. I said, it's nice down there. He said, what do you mean? I said, it's like London Underground. It's got strip lighting and whitewashed walls. He said, where do you go? I said, so-and-so colliery. He said, what are you doing tomorrow? I said, nothing. He said, you come with me. And he took me down the pit, and he was a coal-faced worker, always like my father, and he took me down into a scene where men were on their bellies getting coal. I've never been as frightened in all my life, and I came out the pit, and I just so stood there, and he said, what do you reckon now? And I said, not for 100 quid a shift. And he said, no. He said, if I see you at the pit gate, I'll kick you all the way home. And that was the end of it, you know. I mean, and it was a marvellous lesson from him. He just didn't want me to go down at all, and quite rightly, because it's a dirty, dangerous job, no matter which way you look at it. And I think they're worth every penny they get.
On the other hand, though, at that stage, did you say, right, I'm going to be a journalist? I mean, was it a question that you wanted to write?
I was full of fantasy. My mother was a great reader and used to bring home 4 or 5 books a week from the library, and I used to get stuck into those. And then she used to take me to the movies 4 or 5 nights a week. The movie was really it was my horizon. You know, I used to sit there. Before I went to New York, I remember I knew New York 20 years before I got there. I knew what the taxi drivers looked like. I knew every street in New York from the movies. And I sat there, and one day, and it's as simple and as absurd as this, and I saw a film with Humphrey Bogart in it, playing the part of a reporter. And all he ever did in the movie was he put the telephone there, cradled it, and said, hold the front page. And I used to practice this in the local phone box. I used to talk to the local, I mean, she was convinced she got a nutter on the end of the line. You know. And that was really the start of it all. And he used to wear a snap-brim trilby and a raincoat, you know, belted raincoat. And when I got a job as a local journalist when I was 16, I worked for the local newspaper, and I used to ride a bike, a big drop-handled rally, around these pit villages to collect the news. I dressed like Humphrey Bogart. I bought the white Mac with the tie belt, and I bought a pearl grey snap-brim fedora. Can you imagine that? In Barnsley? And I used to drive around. Of course, the practicality of it was that you couldn't do it because the hat would fly off. So I borrowed, and she still doesn't know it to this day, about half a yard of my Auntie Madge's knicker elastic. And I made a chin strap. So I became the only person in the world with a snap-brim fedora with a knicker elastic chin strap. The only problem with that was going around on my bike was that going downhill was a problem. Because if there's a wind you're going into, it used to billow off my head like that. And you know those supersonic aeroplanes with the resting parachutes? I look just like one of them coming into land. That's right.
You've brought out your book this year, The Best of Parkinson, and obviously included in that are hundreds of the people that you've interviewed on your programmes. I'm not going to ask you about your favourites, but I would like to know about some of those unscheduled moments.
Oh, well, I mean, they're the kind of stuff of talk shows, aren't they, I think, of interviews. I mean, you can plan an interview, and you should, you know, down to the last final detail, but always something will happen that you know, throws you, and then it depends on your experience how you cope with it. I mean, the first one that ever happened to me, actually, I was on a program called Cinema, and I interviewed a man called Sam Peckinpah, and we were actually doing this on film. So it was Slate 1, Take 1, Parkinson, Peckinpah, and I'd done my research, and I was about to prove to him I did. And I said, Mr. Peckinpah, I said, you started life as a director. He said, nope, as a writer. All right, take 2. Mr. Peckinpah, you started life as a writer. Nope, as a director. Now, this went on for 30 takes. I mean, at the end of it, that's all we put out, was me doing that. I mean, that was, of course, due to an excess of an intake of alcohol, I suppose, before he went on. Those are the moments you... Well, it's true. I mean, because it's all very well laughing. You should try talking to them. I mean, those have been the great disasters of being when, for one reason or another, they've been tired and emotional when they arrived in the studio. I had one or two classic things, I suppose, with Muhammad Ali. I mean, I had a row with him on air, which became quite notorious. And, of course, the problem you have there is another one. I mean, it's one thing sitting next to a sort of jockey who gets angry with you, but when you sit next to 16.5 stone of angry heavyweights, then
Not
the
the
options...
wisest decision.
Well, yeah, it seemed to me that there were 3 things. I mean, he really went berserk, and you saw the other side of Ali. He wasn't kidding. He wasn't selling tickets. I mean, he really went at me, and I was sort of ignorant white man and all this nonsense. And I sat there and I felt so sad because he was showing a side of him, actually, that the British public particularly didn't want to see. He was more liked here than anywhere else in the world, you know. And then I thought, well, what are the alternatives? I mean, do I shout back at him, in which case, you know, you've got 2 irrational people screaming? Do I walk off, in which case there's no show? And I got good cause to walk off. Or do I sit there and let it all die down, which I did, and it all died down. At the end of the show, there were none of the normal pleasantries. We didn't sort of put our arms around each other and sort of fall on the floor in a sort of orgy of self-congratulation. I went out the door that way, and he went out that way. And I went up to my dressing room, and I sat there, and I felt very, very disgruntled about the entire thing, because I thought I'd done it badly, I'd handled it badly. And I also thought, as I said, that he'd let himself down, in a sense. And I wondered how I might otherwise have dealt with it. And there was a knock on my door, and the aforesaid father of mine was standing there, and he had been in the audience, and he stood there, and he said, now then, which for my father was a speech. And I said, he said, what you reckon then, lad? I said, not much. He said, no, nor did I. He said, what were wrong with thee? I said, me? I said, what about him, there, lad? He said, it was your fault. I said, Dad, what could I have done? He said, why don't I thump him? Now, I'd never thought of that. My father would have thumped him, of that there's no doubt.
On the other hand, I mean, you walked in this afternoon in such a suave fashion, as you did walk down lots of stairs during, what, 361 shows. Mm. But there was one occasion, wasn't there, which nobody saw, which wasn't just quite so suave.
Well, they did actually see it, because Richard Druitt was the executive producer of this year's show here. I mean, he actually put it on later. It was when I was interviewing Fred Astaire, and Fred Astaire was my great hero. I think of all the people that I met, he was the one who I most wanted to meet, because I admired him so much. And he was very, very nervous. And I said to him at the back of the set, as that clock was ticking away, 10 seconds to go, I said, you have to understand the thrill it is. I said, because when I was a kid, I used to imitate 2 great walks, yours and John Wayne. I said, I used to walk like them back from the cinema. And then I walked on, they played my theme music, and I fell from the top step to the bottom. I just went wallop. And I got up and walked back, and there was Astaire, convulsed with laughter at the back of the set, and he said, I guess you just got us confused between Duke and myself. And then, of course, what the terrifying thing about it was, to underline my clumsiness, was that 2 minutes later, he didn't walk downstairs, he glided downstairs, and he never touched a stair. But I mean, with the hand in the pocket, you know, it's amazing. He was a man of such style and such talent.
In your book, I mean, obviously you've included Dame Edith Evans, and you've said many times how much you absolutely adore her. I mean, what was so special about her?
She had style, again. I mean, I admired that quality in people. She had also manners, and she was a star. And she knew how to behave like a star. And it's a discernible fact that a lot of the younger generation of stars I've had on the show, whether they come from theatre, films, or indeed pop, where the new superstars are, actually, the majority don't know how to behave like a star. They want the trimmings, they want all that, but they don't fulfill that glamorous expectancy that the audience want from them. And Edith always did that, you see. I mean, she would arrive at my show in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, a big white Rolls-Royce, wearing a new frock by Norman Hartnell, and she would have a white mink coat on, and immediately she would start berating anybody who came near her about the state of the old-age pensioner. I mean, she said, I don't know how we manage. I was down collecting my pension the other day, and I was saying to the man, yeah, I'm going to get on this. And I eventually, after about the third time I met her, and you had to be careful with her because she was very grand, I said, Dame Edith, you know, it doesn't wash. She said, what doesn't wash? I said, all this talk about the state of the old age pension. I said, just look at you. She said, what's wrong with me? I said, well, there you are. You're complaining about the old age pension, I said, and you've got this new frock by Norman Hartnell. You've got this mink coat on. And outside, I said, there's a big white Rolls Royce. And she looked at me as if I was daft. She said, would you have me arrive in a Mini? And of course, you wouldn't have her arrive in a Mini because she was a star and she fulfilled all that expectation. She used to watch the show. In those days, we used to have a montage of guests on the show. And she was the first one up at the beginning of the show. And she used to stay up every night or every Saturday just to watch that and then go to bed. But one night she didn't. She stayed up long enough to see me go on the set wearing a new green suit. And 2 days later, I got this letter from her saying, Dear Michael, saw the show last night. The suit is ghastly. Throw it away. Love, Edith. And I did. I mean, that's advice from the gods, you know.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. I know you're going to stay with us until the end of the programme.
Oh,
but in the meantime, Michael Parkinson.
Thank you.